In this lesson, we're going to animate the transition of the first console off. So we're going to make this disappear in a very nice way. And what I'm thinking is to make this look as responsive as possible, as soon as this button is pressed, we need the console to spring into action. And we can do that by using the out expo, which means it's going to instantly do most of its movement and then exponentially get slower or fade out. And let's start by going into the Windows console icons and grabbing these spokes here. So let's hit rotation on these. We can see that we have the keyframes already. So what we want to do is actually cut these off, right? And what we want to do is duplicate them, extend them over here, come forward one frame, zoom in, and cut them here. So we have new spokes for this ending transition. And the reason I like to do that is because with the rotation, we want to apply a different kind of ease and whiz. And the easiest way to do that is just to make a copy, because you can't have two types of ease and whiz, at least to my knowledge, on the same layer. So once we have the new spokes here, we can hit rotation, and let's set the rotation. Let's just make sure this is the exact frame. So this is actually the first frame where it needs to happen. So let's move these forward one frame and the old spokes back one frame. And let's start the rotation right now. And in 10 frames, let's make this animation very quick, have all of these come back to 0. So now they're all back in the forward position. We want this to be set to out expo so that it happens very quickly. So you can see in the very first frame, look at how they just spring into action. Now 10 frame transition might be too quick, so let's just make this a 20 frame transition. Let's see how we go with that. Let me just change the work area. Maybe out expo was actually it's too extreme. So let's make it out quint. Let's try that. That's much nicer. Okay, we also want to work with the scale here. So let's go with scale. Let's take away all the, actually let's just solo the scales on these. Let's alt click on these, because what we want to do is just remove all the old keyframes, because we are going to be using different keyframes. I'm going to delete those and set a new one here, come forward 20 frames, and maybe set this to a value where you can't see it anymore. So underneath the console. And let's go out quint with that. Now what we want to do is have these icons scale down. And remembering that our transition to fade away is only 20 frames long, and we're using the out quint setting, let's go into ring A and create the template for the scaling out. So remember that these already have their own ease and whiz settings, and that's set to in out expo, which is definitely not what we want. So what I'm going to do is just create a null object that's in the very center here, set the scale, set it 20 frames forward from 100 to 0 using the quint out feature. And what we're going to do is change the inner ring and outer ring to, actually let's grab the the icon, parent that here. And let's actually hit Alt begin bracket on that to show in the timeline where that starts. And one frame forward, let's actually bring the inner ring and parent that here. And let's duplicate this one frame forward, and let's parent the outer ring to this. And also the fill should also be parented to the same null object that the outer ring is parented to. So there we have it. So this is parented to layer 2, layer 3, and layer 1. Let's preview how this looks. Okay, that's interesting, but I think what we could do is actually make this a little bit quicker. We want the whole thing to wrap up within the 20 frames. So let's bring this in so they all finish within 20 frames, and let's actually have a 2-frame gap in between. So 1, 2 frames, 1, 2. And we could actually make these expo, just because it doesn't look as fast with this because they're not rotating 360 degrees, they're just scaling down. So the expo looks completely fine for that. And let's just preview that animation. It actually does look a little too fast. Let's go back to out quint. Now the reason we're getting so little motion blur with these is because these are actually scaled quite a fair way down. They're parented to the spokes, so that's not the true representation of these, but these are actually fairly large compositions. So what we want to do is actually change the shutter angle in these to something higher so that they actually reflect the proper amount of motion blur when scaled down. And that looks a lot smoother. Okay, so let's repeat that process with all of the other items here. We just need to create the nulls. We can actually copy them from here, copy these nulls, and parent the other layers to them, and then change the shutter angle to 270. We don't need to worry about the shutter phase because this is actually inside the other composition, so that won't matter. So here's how the end transition currently looks. I think it's a little quick, so I'm going to slow it down, but I'll do that in my own time. Just one other thing I wanted to show you before we wrap this lesson up is this radial transition that I've put on all the little icons there, and I actually want to put it on the main logo, but in the opposite direction. So we come into the user interface and inside the Windows console, and here we have the Windows console. So what I'm going to do with this is add in the radial wipe, which is like a preset type thing. It's like a transition, sorry. And what we can do here is set the transition completion from 0%. Let's go forward 20 frames. Currently my animation to disappear is 20 frames, although, as I mentioned, I would like to make that longer. And I'm going to set that to 100%. And let's apply expo out to that. Now we don't get motion blur with that, so we have to add CC force motion blur to that. And I'm going to change the shutter angle to 270, so we get lots of motion blur. Now the only problem is that in doing this, we leave the, well, we can see the spokes underneath it. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate this. And at the very start of the transition, I'm going to Alt-Bing in bracket to begin it here, remove these effects, and apply a black fill to this. So we'll still have something back there that's not allowing us to see the spokes. And what I want to do with this Windows console is just increase the motion blur samples, because if you just set it to 8, you can easily see the samples, and there's nothing uglier than motion blur samples. So let's try that. Let's see how we go. I think that looks pretty good. So what we need to do is now create the other console over here, and that's pretty much just the exact same as the first one. If I scrub through here, we can see that apart from the icons, it is identical and the timing is identical. So I go ahead and create that, and in the next lesson what we'll do is, as soon as the button is pressed, we'll animate the sort of clock-like transition of the icons.